specifically, we're going to be talking about how plants survive the winter. Now, a lot of you have probably noticed when you go outside, there's not a lot of greenery outside in the winter. All the plants have dropped their leaves. A lot of them look like they're dead. So let's talk about how they survive through that, all right? So first things first, let's talk about a couple different kinds of plants. When it comes to plants, we have several different kinds. We've got annuals, perennials, and then there's a few other ones that are kind of similar to these, but these are the main two groups. So we'll talk about these two today. Now you hear these a lot about flowers, okay? Annuals are plants that sprout for 1 year and then they die at the end of the season. Perennials are plants that sprout for 1 year and then they come back years after that, all right? So the ways that these guys survive is that annuals actually will drop their seeds around like in the summer or fall. They drop their seeds and then the plant itself will die, okay? But the seeds are left in the ground. And what's kind of cool about these seeds, guys, for annuals is that they have to go through a really, really cold period before they're ready to come out into a plant. And that way they don't accidentally sprout too early. So some examples of some annuals that you might recognize would be pansies or begonias, marigolds, chrysanthemum. Even if you don't recognize these names, if you look these up, you might recognize the look of the flower, okay? So these are ones that will only grow for 1 warm season and then the whole plant will die, but the seeds that they've spread will create more plants. Then we have perennials. Now perennials are ones, like I said, that come back every single year. This can be sometimes a little bit confusing though, because if you look, you're not seeing lilies or lavender or lilac. You're not seeing any of those in the winter, so it's a little like, well, where did they go? They're not dropping their seeds in the ground. They're actually surviving just by their roots. So things like annuals are going to have very small, hairy roots, like what you think of when you think of roots. But perennials are going to have things like bulbs, tubers, rhizomes, or tap roots. And those are all kind of similar things. It's things like when you think about carrot, that's a tap root. So that right there is the root that has a ton of sugar and starch in it that help the plant to survive through the winter. So plants like these will have bulbs or will have long roots like a tap root that will help them survive using the fuel stored in there, and then they'll grow new shoots above ground every single year, but it's the same plant. So that's why it's a perennial and not an annual. All right, so looking closer at perennials, there's actually a few different groups. We talked about the grassy perennials. Those are things like lilies that we looked at. Those ones have bulbs or tubers underneath the ground that hold a lot of sugar and starch for the plant to survive. And they put up new shoots above ground every single year. Then we have woody perennials. This actually includes things like trees. So under woody perennials, we also have things like roses. If you look at a rose bush, it's going to stop having flowers, its leaves are going to be brown and dry during the winter, but it'll still have plant above ground, right? So woody perennials don't survive using the same methods as grassy perennials. These guys use bulbs. These guys actually use sap to their advantage. Now what's really cool is that the reason that the plant looks the way that it does, the reason it looks all dried and shriveled is kind of because it is. So what happens is that the roots underground are more protected from the cold because of the layer of soil, the layer of dead leaves, even a layer of snow can help keep temperatures even underneath the ground. So what happens is that all the water that's up in the branches above ground gets pulled down into the roots. And once it's down in those roots, the plant will also put out sap up through the plant all throughout it, and that helps it kind of like an antifreeze. It makes it so that the water inside of the plant is less likely to crystallize, which would damage the cells inside of the plant, which is why they don't want it to freeze in the first place. So the sap helps keep the plant from freezing. And this is actually where maple syrup comes from, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Okay, so talking about woody plants, specifically trees, they fall into two different categories. And we talked about these last season. We talked about deciduous and coniferous plants. Can you guys remember what the difference is? That's okay, I'll tell you. All right, so the deciduous plants are ones that decide to lose their leaves. That's how I remember it. And the coniferous plants are more cone-shaped. So the deciduous plants are things like aspen, oak, maple, anything with big, broad leaves. Those ones are going to fall off in the fall, and they are going to grow back in the spring. Now that reason is the same reason we talked about just a second ago with other perennials, is that they don't want their the tissues in them that hold all the cells that hold water, they don't want them to freeze and crystallize, because if a cell has the crystals inside it, it'll actually expand and break the cell. So we don't want anything to form ice crystals. So instead, they just ditch all of their leaves and they store all their water down in the roots. Now this is especially important with a deciduous tree because deciduous leaves have little tiny holes in the bottom called stomata. And the stomata release gases and take in water, but also they release water. It's easy for them to just evaporate out of it, okay? And the stomata are important, but when there's not a lot of sun and not as much heat in the winter, it's more beneficial to drop the leaves and store all the water in the roots rather than hoping that it does not release through the stomata. So that's one reason that deciduous trees lose their leaves. Looking at coniferous plants, they don't have the same style of stomata. They have a really thick, waxy coating on those needles, and it keeps all the water inside the plant. So it's still going to try and store some of its water lower down underneath the ground when it gets cold, but generally they will stay pretty much the same year round. Now let's go and talk about our activity for this week.
Hi you guys, this is Sarah, welcome back. We are doing our activity for this week. We are basically going to be playing a game, is it alive or is it not? So what you need to do is, first of all, get permission from your parents, from the owners of the plants. So much permission, you guys. Make sure that this is okay and don't do this by yourself, and make sure that you're safe handling your knife. But what you're going to do is you're going to look at a plant and you're going to say, okay, I'm not really sure if this is alive or not, and you can scrape a little bit very gently of the outside of either the branch or the bark of the tree and see if it is green or if there is some coloring underneath to help you know that it's alive. So we're going to do that on this. It looks kind of yellow, looks like it's not really alive, but what we can do, you can see I scraped a little piece already. Doesn't take a lot. It's very, very green under there and scraped very, very easily. If we did that on a tree, it would be even harder. So what I want you guys to do is do this, draw that coloration in your field journal, eat a potato this week, eat some maple syrup, think about plants and think about those adaptations. We'll see you guys next week.